Okay, we're gonna begin. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the launch of a really interesting piece of research co-funded by Trust for London, London Councils, the London Housing Directors Group, and Capital Letters. The research is going to be published today on the Trust for London website and also, I think, on the London Council's website. And really, it goes to the heart of one of the issues that is really affecting so many people in the city today, which is around the private rented sector, specifically the supply of rental homes in London. Certainly, our latest data on poverty in London shows, bizarrely, uh, in sort of 2021-22, we had the lowest level of poverty in London since the sort of measure began in 1996. So something strange is going on, given the perma crisis we seem to be in. And we think part of the answer there lies in the private rented sector and what's happening there. So we'll get to explore lots of conversations about supply today and what's happening, particularly for low-income Londoners in their end of the market. And we've got some fantastic speakers who will hopefully be able to shed some light into what's going on. So we've got Abby Davies and Kath Scanlon, the research team, Abby from Savills and Kath from LSE, and we'll start off with a presentation from them both around the research. We've also got them responding, Jamie Thunder and Sharmarke, Diriye, and Kojo Sarpong, who will provide their immediate sort of responses to the research. And then we'll open it up to sort of Q&A from the crowd. So lots to get on with. We are recording today's session, so just making sure everyone's aware of that, so people who can't attend can see it after the event. And as I said, there's no chat available, but the Q&A will be open for you to post questions for the speakers today, and we'll go through those after everything. So we're going to start with Abby and Kath. So I'm going to hand over to them to share their screen and go through their presentation for around 15 minutes or so.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Manny. Right, let's get some slides up for you. Hopefully that is all okay and you can see it. So we are very pleased to have done this research for London Councils and Trust for London and other partners. It's very good news that we're able to speak to you today, quite a diverse audience with a range of experiences around the private rented sector. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion. My absolute key point in this is that when we're having debate and policy making relating to the private rented sector, it's so important to understand the complexities of the picture when we're informing that debate and informing any policy consequences that come from it. So I'm hoping that the work that Savills and LSE have done is going to assist with that. And one of the main reasons I say that, sorry, just to clarify what we were asked to look at, which was what are the causal factors driving the reduction in availability of private rented accommodation in London? Now, when we say availability, that means different things to different people. So we were really thinking about, is this property part of the private rented sector, i.e. it's not owner occupied, for example? Is it becoming vacant and available to let, and can particular groups access it? So we've looked at the whole London market, but we've had a particular focus on the property that might be available to lower income households and to local authorities who are trying to procure or facilitate access to accommodation for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And the reason I said it was important to understand the complexities is because this issue is really complex. I'm not going to read every point that's on this slide, but there really is an awful lot going on. There's a lot of factors driving the changes that people are experiencing and articulating in the sector at present. So it's not just one thing, and I'm now going to set out some of the things that it is. Basically, I've got the data slides, and I'll hand over to Kath for more of the narrative analysis, and then we've got some recommendations that we will come back to at the end. I'm going to go through quite quickly, so I do recommend you have a look at the report because there's an awful lot more in there than I'm able to unpick today. The first key point, and the one that's leading the media coverage of this work that you may have seen this morning, is that listings, as in advertised availability of property, are down significantly compared to the pre-COVID average. So for 1, 2 and 3 bed homes taken together, there's 36% decrease in lettings since the pre-COVID position. If you factor in 4 bed properties as well, that increases to about a 40% decline in availability of property. We've seen greater fluctuations in inner London, which makes it feel more turbulent to people who are there. And we've also seen more in London because the size of the private rented sector is greater there. We know that turnover, as in how many people move house in the private rented sector, has declined since 2009. Now, for many people, of course, that's great because it means you don't have to, people are moving less often when they don't want to. However, we will come on to that aspect of things in a moment. When it's not so great, of course, is when you want to move and can't get somewhere else. If you want to be in a property that's better suited to your needs, or a location or a tenure, for example, and can't move, that's clearly more of an issue. However, tenancy turnover has decreased, and the lengths of tenancies have broadly doubled between 2009 and 2021. We also see far more families and a greater number of children living in the private rented sector over the period 2011 to 2021. Rental prices have increased. Now, these are asking rents. This isn't what people is paying. It's prices that are advertised. So we saw that rents had grown by 20% between March 2020 and February 2023. That's in London. There are differences between inner and outer London because of what happened in the pandemic being different in different parts of London. Earnings growth in Great Britain as a whole has been 18% over the same period. So in theory, 18% compared to the 20% kind of tracks, as you can see on the graph. But obviously, if you are a low-income household whose income hasn't done that, or you are on local housing allowance that has been frozen in that time, or if you're a local authority with constrained spending power, clearly that issue is not so easy. So if we look at local housing allowance rates, we come up with a headline figure that just 2.3% of listings were available or affordable to local housing allowance claimants in 2022 to 2023. That is setting aside the effect of the benefit cap. So that assumes that you are not benefit capped, that figure. We know that obviously local housing allowance increased significantly in the pandemic, and the effect of rents falling in the pandemic and LHA going up did increase the availability, never to the 30th percentile, but increased it. But you can see here just how quickly that has fallen back to where it was before. This looks just at the last 4 quarters where data is available. So actually in the most recent quarter, it was just 1.9% of listings. And actually it's worse for 2 and 3 beds than it was for 1 bed. So you see on your screen, the orange and red bars are 2 and 3 bed properties. So there is slightly more affordability for 1 beds. But if you're a family in that sector, that a 1 bed is not what you want or need. Obviously, where local authorities are leasing property for temporary accommodation, their funding rules are complicated and constrained, and they are similarly affected by a limit on what they can claim back from the central government for their costs compared to where rents are, and that's a very significant pressure on local authority spending at present. If we look at the buy-to-let mortgage market, so this isn't the whole buy-to-let sector, this is people who have buy-to-let properties and a mortgage on them. We can see that the mortgage market is contracting. So for the first time, we've seen more loans maturing than we have loans being taken out. That's where, just at the bottom corner of this graph, where it falls, the black line falls to the line. That's what I'm describing there. And as 73% of buy-to-let lending is interest only, the incentive to sell to realise capital growth is very high. This is taken from Zoopla data, which is not public data. We can see that more homes that have been listed as for rental are then moving into being listed for sale. So in 2022, we see 40% of properties listed on Zoopla for sale had been in the private rental sector and listed to rent previously. It's a big growth in previous years. And we see here that it's particularly affecting lower rental price bands in London. So this basically shows you the spread of monthly asking rents and then which properties then became available for sale. And we can see that the number is high for the lower cost properties. I'm going to hand over to Kath now to try and unpick some of what that means for landlords and what's driving it.
Thank you, Abby. I'm going to tell you about the stream of qualitative research that we did as part of this project. Savills handled the quantitative analysis, which Abby has presented. And we did 2 surveys of landlords with properties in London, one of members of the National Residential Landlords Association, and one hosted on LSE's own survey platform. And together they had about 350 responses from London landlords. We also conducted a couple of focus groups and a series of interviews, and we did some analysis of online landlord forums. So the findings I'm going to tell you about come out of that research. We found that more landlords were planning to reduce their holdings of rental property than were planning to buy more properties. And all of this is specific to landlords with London properties only. The difference was very significant. 4 times more were planning to sell than planning to buy. We asked if these were recent decisions or part of their long-term plan, because a lot of landlords have assets that they plan to sell as they reach retirement age, and so that has been something that they've been planning to do for decades. But the message was that in most cases it was a recent decision, so reflecting factors that had come up recently. Relatively few said that they were going, of those who were going to sell, said that they were going to buy residential property with the money they got. Most were planning to reinvest in other assets. And it was mainly the small amateur landlords who were planning to get out of the sector, whereas portfolio landlords, those with larger holdings, were more likely to remain, and they were more likely to be the ones saying they were planning to buy. This project looked specifically at what was going on in the lower end of the market with landlords who were letting to lower income households or letting to local authorities. So we asked landlords if they were active in that part of the market or had been recently. And of those who were, 40% said that they were now letting fewer properties to low income households than they had done in the past. And 38% who had worked with local authorities before said now they were letting fewer properties that way. Most of them still owned and let out those properties that had previously been let to local authorities or to lower income households, but they were now renting them to a different part of the market. And notably, many landlords mentioned that there was increasing demand from other bodies looking to procure that kind of accommodation, and particularly the Home Office, which was able to offer rents and conditions that local authorities couldn't match. So what are these recent decisions that landlords have made about getting out of the sector? What are the drivers of those decisions? Well, one clear one is that costs have been increasing, particularly in this period of very strongly rising interest rates. 40% of the properties that we had information about were mortgage properties. Most of those have interest-only mortgages at variable rates. So clearly, with what's been happening to interest rates, costs have been going up very quickly for those landlords who do have mortgages. There were also concerns expressed about tenant reliability and the benefit system, about LHA rates not tracking market rents, and about the changing regulatory and fiscal context. In terms of regulation, the landlord licensing and particularly HMO licensing were mentioned, as well as the need to meet energy performance requirements in the next few years. Particularly landlords with older properties said the cost of that would simply drive them to sell because they couldn't recoup it. In terms of the tax system, the change in the tax treatment of mortgage interest, which means that it's no longer deductible at the landlord's marginal rate, has a much bigger impact on cash flow with higher mortgage interest rates. And there have also been increases to stamp duty, land tax, capital gains tax, and the timing that that's paid. So all of those have tended to make to generate incentives to leave the sector. Finally, negative messaging from what landlords perceive the government and the media to be blaming them for the problems in the housing sector, and several said that that was influencing their decisions about going forward. Abby showed you the slides about the sales of previously let properties, that we have indications that a lot of properties are being listed for sale that had previously been rented. So what happens to those properties that are sold? What tenure do they go into? Because in this country, market properties are tenure flexible, so any individual property can be rented or owner occupied. Landlords on the whole do not intentionally set out to sell to other landlords, and we only had a single respondent who said that they had sold with a sitting tenant. So properties are being sold, those that are being sold with vacant possession, which means that the tenants would have had to leave. Landlords generally don't know who buys the properties or what the intentions are of the buyers. So it may well be that properties are being sold to other landlords, especially to portfolio landlords, and equally they can be sold into owner occupation. We don't have the data to conclusively show that the PRS is shrinking, because we cannot track those properties through into their next tenure with the data that we had available. There is clearly a huge amount of turbulence in the market, and that turbulence may be interpreted as decline. It has certainly been very disruptive, especially to local authorities who are trying to carry out their duties to homeless households and those threatened with homelessness. They are facing a very clear reduction in the availability of property for those submarkets. This is unprecedented in the experience of the local authorities and agents that we spoke to, and it's affecting directly those people who need to access the lower end of the market. So less effect on the upper end of the sector. We don't expect to see these drivers change in the short term. Interest rates look set to rise still further, if anything, and that will contribute to driving rental growth. That will, in turn, further reduce tenant turnover, because those tenants who want to get into owner occupation are going to find it more of a challenge to buy, and the reduction in rental availability means that it'll be harder to find somewhere else to rent. There'll also be this continuing impact on landlord acquisition and sale behaviors, and we expect to see those trends continue in the short term. There are also longer term trends that these trends won't continue indefinitely, but we can't say when the turning point will be reached. The effects are felt across London. It's not a phenomenon specific to inner London or outer London or particular types of properties, but it does particularly affect local authorities and households that are claiming benefits.
Thank you very much, Kath. So obviously the questions that arise from those findings are, well, what could be done about it? We've come up with a number of recommendations. Some of them are what I would describe as short-term and palliative, and a couple are larger. So the bigger takeaway, please listen recommendations are that we really need a national strategy on private renting, because influences on how private rental behaves include tax and so on. It can't just be a London strategy, it has to involve the national government. And that needs to be based on a review in order to bring a proper understanding of how different interventions impact. If you remember that early slide I put up with all those yellow dots on it, those are the bits that can change and move if you have interventions in the sector. So we need a strategy, and it needs to be underpinned by understanding and review. We very much need local housing allowance rates to increase, and the amount of money that is rebated to local authorities when they pay housing benefit to people who are in temporary accommodation needs to increase. And all of that needs to take account of the benefit cap and how that plays out on what households can receive and how that affects their purchasing power. That will obviously support people's participation in the lower end of the market, but we also need to encourage landlords to be able to participate in that part of the market as well. And if and when properties are leaving the sector, or at least available for sale from their current owner, we would really recommend that public bodies, our organisations acting on behalf of public bodies, are supported to acquire those properties and therefore to build up a standing stock of accommodation that can be used in the way that is very much needed by people who are participating in that part of the sector. There are some day-to-day recommendations that may also help. So landlord anxiety, for example, I think we all know that when the policy is change is coming, people complain and worry about it. However, that shouldn't be dismissed, because it actually drives what people do. So if people are better informed at a local level around what happens with local initiatives and national initiatives and how that might impact on them and how that can be allayed, that would really help to just calm behaviours in the market. Similarly, landlords don't always have real detailed factual insights to inform their decisions around what they're doing with properties, particularly in terms of retained ownership of those, or whether that compares well to other investments they could have made. So a good strong factual information basis to shape those decisions would be beneficial. Renters Reform Bill, obviously in the Parliament at the moment, we need to understand how those provisions will impact on people, not so we can argue not to shape the quality and control in the sector, but so that we can understand what would happen and make sure that properties aren't lost. Similarly, to give reassurance, as many local authorities and supporting organisations do at the moment, around helping tenant behaviours and giving landlords some guarantees that the risk they may perceive in renting in this part of the market is not materialising for them. And similarly, we say this over and over again, we need to reduce competition between public sector bodies to procure accommodation, because driving up the price faced by different parts of the public sector is not very helpful. But as I said, my key takeaways really are, please review of the private rented sector, national strategy for it, sort out local housing allowance and the associated housing benefit rebates to local authorities. That is a summary of our key findings. I'm not going to restate them. You can find them in our report, which is out today. I will stop sharing slides now so that you can see all of the panel. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Abby and Kath, for a really insightful presentation. It's great that we've already got questions coming in on the chat, so please do post anything that's come to mind from that presentation. We will come back to those questions after we've heard from our panel. So what we're going to do now is the panel members will each give a response. We'll then have a short sort of panel discussion, and then we've got a good half an hour to answer the questions that the audience is putting forward. So there's plenty of time to get through everything. I'm going to come to the panel, Jamie, Sharmarke, and then Kojo in that order. If you could introduce yourselves, that would be great. And you've got sort of 5 minutes each really to respond. So Jamie, could we start with you?
Thank you, Manny. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, thank you to Trust for London for the invitation to be here, and indeed to Savills and the LSE for that research and really informative presentation. For those of you who don't know Z2K, we are an anti-poverty charity that provides specialist advice, support and advocacy on benefits and housing issues to over 1,000 people a year in London. And we use the insights from that casework to push for change locally and nationally. I'm just going to set out some reflections on the implications of what Abigail and Kath have just talked about for households that are in poverty, so the people who are more likely to be represented among our clients. In 2021, we published a Tenant's Voice manifesto that set out the changes that people with lived experience of that lower end of the private rented sector wanted to see. These weren't pie in the sky recommendations. They were things like accessible and affordable housing, and for properties to be of decent quality and kept in decent states of repair. But we can see that significant pressures in PRS supply, particularly at that bottom end of the market, makes even these ambitions harder to achieve. I mean, the very simplest, a rental property being sold, as the presentation set out, almost certainly means a tenant being evicted, which of course in itself is simply a stressful experience to go through. It's, as it happens, it's one that I'm about to go through myself. And the supply pressures leave people with next to no choice of where's next. The fact that under 1 in 40 advertised lets is covered by local housing allowance, 2.3%, is just incredible. And it chimes with recent research as well from both Crisis and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And that means that almost everyone relying on benefits to pay their rent has to choose between some combination of falling behind on your rent, taking money from elsewhere, perhaps your disability benefits if you're getting those, or saving costs, saving money by not turning the heating on or visiting a food bank so that your money goes to your landlord rather than to Tesco. Or it leads to multi-generational families having to live in cramped and crowded surroundings because nobody can afford to move out. These aren't the sort of choices that anyone should have to make. And we completely support the recommendations, particularly of increasing local housing allowance rates and addressing the benefit cap, which takes an average of £50 a week from households affected, which obviously adds to already difficult affordability challenges. Falling supply also means that an unscrupulous landlord has little reason to keep a property in a good state of repair because there'll pretty much always be someone desperate enough to live there, no matter the condition of the property. And no local authority environmental health team can be expected to regulate every poor quality property. That's simply not going to happen. The private rented sector isn't the only solution to housing problems faced by low-income households. Clearly, social housing needs to be a much bigger part of our housing mix, but it has a part to play today, and it's likely to have a part to play realistically in the future. And so we really welcome this research, and we hope the proposals that are set out here will help prevent an already really challenging situation for our clients and an awful lot of other people like them from getting even worse. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Sharmarke, can I go to you next?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. So my name is Shama Desai from a charity called Golden Opportunity Skills and Development. So we are quite a small charity based in West London, but we've been doing a lot of work around, providing advice on things like housing, homelessness. We are also an AQS accredited organization to provide this kind of advice. Now, we work with so many different communities. So we work with, Nepalese communities, Gujarati speaking communities, communities from other parts of Africa, the Nepalese and different. So we, when you work with a lot of these communities, poverty is a big issue, and renting privately has always been an issue. It's something that we've known for many, many years that it will come to this kind of tipping point. And just one of the things I can maybe add, which would be maybe one of the triggers some of the things that have been perfectly presented by Abigail and Kath is that during the pandemic, what happened is there was a need to place everybody into some kind of accommodation. So happened there was nobody on the street. So the people who were on the streets. So for us as a charity, we thought it's a very good idea because nobody is homeless anymore. So we think because of that, all the stock within councils and all that were taken up, private accommodations were taken up. And after the period where people are supposed to leave these properties, actually a lot of people found that they've got rights now to stay in these places. So they kind of got support maybe to be advocated for, and they stayed. So we think that also that actually added on to what was already a very strained kind of private sector accommodation. Now, this research actually is fantastic because it's a clear indication of, as I said, what we've always been worried about. And as Jamie mentioned, the flip side of the coin is that, we've seen a lot of terrible kind of conditions in these private accommodations, and people always. So we had, for example, during the pandemic, when we're delivering food, we found a lady staying in a property where there's no windows. So it's a basement, there's no windows completely. It's a private accommodation, but she was actually placed there, So in terms of, for example, in Ealing, where we work, where we're based, at the moment, Ealing Council, I think, have placed about 100 families into, hotel accommodations. And of course, that's suitable, especially for families with children. There's no cooking facilities, such things. So we can see straight away there's, the councils are trying to do something, but there's no coherent kind of, councils maybe working together, or as this recommendation from the research. I think we need some kind of concerted effort by everybody else to sort out the problem. So we, as an organization, we have about, I think, 150 people on temporary accommodation. I mean, just a small organization, and it's a huge issue around that. And also, one thing we've also found about private accommodation is that there's been situations where councils have been held at ransom, where they have to actually pay more than they're supposed to pay to place people in temporary accommodation. So I think there's a lot of things that needs to be looked at, and we think also there should be some kind of shift to look at, people already living in these accommodations, especially people on low income, and to see how they can also contribute their voice to actually what's happening. Because at the moment, people are not consulted properly. It's only councils or landlords might maybe say things, but actually people who live in these places are not being consulted properly. So thank you for that, and hopefully I can answer any questions later.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. And then over to Kojo to offer a local authority perspective.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kojo Sarpong. I'm the Director of Housing Needs for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Just a quick explanation of what I do. Manage a housing department that tries to prevent homelessness for residents who are in need of accommodation or who are approaching us for housing assistance under the provisions of the Homelessness Reduction Act. We have a duty to assess applications. In some instances, we provide temporary accommodation, and we're also responsible for the permanent rehousing of those residents, whether it's into the social sector or into the private sector. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the presentation and the report, which is very, very important and interesting. I think that we can all accept that this is a very diabolical situation, both locally, regionally and nationally. And I think that for Londoners, it's particularly difficult because across the country, we have the most households in temporary accommodation, and especially for those who are struggling the most, there's a major impact. We are in a position now where I think it is definitely transitioning from being a crisis to an emergency. a housing emergency, and as has been mentioned by the fellow panel members, we do all need to be working together to be trying to pull in the right direction. In my experience, you know, most people who enter into housing to help people. For our frontline staff, it is exceptionally difficult to help residents when there are limited options. Unfortunately, the private sector market is shrinking. We do have a situation where a lot of local authorities have lost a lot of stock due to, you know, right to buy. And I'm not here to talk about it, you know, the rights or wrongs of right to buy, but it's something that's definitely had an impact. For us as local authorities, we're definitely having more homelessness presentations. So for us, in terms of Kensington and Chelsea, last year, we had a 14% increase in homelessness presentations in comparison to the corresponding period the year before. There is definitely an increase in homelessness prevention and homelessness relief cases across London, which is reflected in the data. There are fewer options on the market for us to actually prevent and relieve homelessness. And even though some local authorities, like for example RBKC, when we've got a new build program, the amount of properties that we are building is not enough to meet the demand. Last year, we had, as I mentioned, we had a 14% increase in homelessness. We also had a 3% reduction in the number of social lets. So social lets is properties which is from local authorities or housing associations. So the demand definitely outweighs the supply. In terms of for Londoners, you know, we have about over 100,000 households who are in temporary accommodation right now. As has been mentioned, there is definitely a significant increase in the proportion of households who are being placed into commercial hotels. And the reason why that is because there's been less private sector accommodation available, and that could be because landlords are exiting the market, and there's various reasons, as has been outlined in the presentation, as to why landlords are exiting the market. We have seen an increase in landlords requesting their properties back from us, so which is making it very difficult to comply with our statutory duties to provide interim accommodation pending the outcome of an assessment. And we have a situation whereby the landlords are requesting the properties back. There's an increased demand. People are spending longer in commercial hotels, which none of us want, because we know that is not ideal. We're getting increased legal challenges, and we're getting increased challenges from the local government ombudsman as well about failure to provide suitable accommodation. And it's just a hotbed of really of a difficult situation, which appears to be worsening. We're definitely on target to have the highest number of households in commercial hotels and temporary accommodation generally for a sustained period of time. As I mentioned, it is dreadful that we have got households who are in B&B, and we don't want them to be in that situation, even for a short period of time, let alone for a long period of time. But there are a number of things we need to do, in my opinion, to try and address the issue. And one of them is definitely about not demonizing landlords. The fact of the matter is that we are more and more reliant on the private sector, whether we like it or not. There are definitely some rogue landlords out there, and it's very important that we improve standards and we work to improve standards. However, there are also a large portion of landlords who are actually good landlords who it is a business, but they do care about providing good quality homes for residents. As has been mentioned by Kath in the presentation, the taxation is definitely having an impact on landlords. The interest rates is having an impact on landlords. Selective licensing in various areas is having an impact on landlords, and I'm not saying that selective licensing is not a thing, but that's another cost which the landlords are incurring. And the thing is, what that's doing is transferring the cost onto the residents, or it's forcing landlords to leave the market, which means that we have to place people in commercial hotels, which is a lot more expensive than providing people with private sector accommodation. So what I'm just going to wrap up on is that the system is definitely broken, and we need to work towards fixing it. And one of the ways of fixing it is definitely working with government around the local housing allowance. The local housing allowance for temporary accommodation has remained the same since January 2011. Rents have not remained the same since then. And for the PRS, it's remained the same since April 2020. So there needs to be a recognition that in order to support the most vulnerable in society, we do need to look at the whole local housing allowance rate and work with the people who we're relying on to provide accommodation, so that everybody can benefit rather than a few.
Thanks very much, Kojo. So really, really interesting reflections there from the panel. I'm going to dive into a panel conversation. There's been a question in the chat around whether we will share the recording and the PowerPoint slides. So the recording will go on YouTube, and we will also share the PowerPoint slides too. So if you're furiously making notes, don't worry, there'll be something to refer to afterwards. I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to pick up where Kojo left off there. We don't have any PRS landlords on the panel, so I'm going to adopt that quite undesirable job title for a few moments and ask you: is there a grain of truth in the complaints that landlords have about what's happening to them right now? Maybe I'm going to start with Savills. I think if that's you're the closest, perhaps closest to being a property management landlord.
Well, there are many and different types of private landlord, aren't there? And so I think if you are a small landlord that doesn't necessarily have a huge expertise or background in property management, you will feel the effects of those things more strongly. If you are a landlord that has borrowed money to buy your property, that is a significant part of your costs on top of tax, which has increased again significantly in recent years. If you are a portfolio landlord, if you hold your property in a company rather than an individual, you will have a different experience. But working across different areas with different licensing standards is an issue. And then, of course, the sort of narrative going on around. So I think that what we've found in our research from speaking to people rings true with the data that we can see. But that doesn't mean don't do anything to shape or influence the market, does it? What we're asking here really is for a market to provide for people who need sub-market accommodation. So that is actually challenge one. And challenge two is, given that those people are the actors in the market, do we want to encourage them to stay and be able to make use of their properties? If so, how do you make that work in a non-combative way?
Any other thoughts on the landlord, whether the landlord's perspective is
I'm happy.
Yeah, Kojo, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. So I think that we for a good few years now, we've been in a situation where landlords have been requesting increases in their rates, and they have been working with us. So there's been some slight increases, but now the increases seems to be a lot larger, and I link that in definitely with the current financial climate that we are in. There are some landlords who have not increased their rates for a sustained period of time, but because of the changes, they feel that they're compelled to do so. The ones that have requested properties back from us, to our knowledge, a lot of them are actually exiting the market because they think it's unaffordable for them to maintain it at the level that they're charging it at, in order for low-income households to be tenanted in their properties. So I think that to me, that's just a clear sign. It's just telling us a story that the current financial climate is making it really difficult to sustain the properties as they are. And what that means is, for us as local authorities, there was a comment in the in the slides about not skewing the market and effectively local authorities holding the line. But there's a difficult balancing act we have in the sense of we have a statutory duty to provide suitable accommodation, right? And if we don't provide that suitable accommodation, and I don't really want to talk about finances, but I'm going to just briefly touch on it. If we don't provide that suitable accommodation, we're at financial risk in terms of losing a judicial review and being instructed to accommodate in suitable accommodation and pay cost. We're also at risk of losing to the local government ombudsman and them awarding the resident funds and us having to pay resident funds on a continual basis until we provide them with suitable accommodation. But the backdrop of that is that doesn't, even if we're facing those financial penalties, that will not increase the availability of suitable accommodation for those residents. So the fact is that we can throw as much money as we want in terms of penalising local authorities and awarding compensation. But effectively, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve providing people with suitable accommodation? And how are we unlocking that? And if we are reliant on the PRS to largely contribute to that, then to me, it's not about giving landlords a leg up. It's about how do we ensure that the system works so that low-income households are supported. We don't have an increased number of households in commercial hotels. We don't have an increased number of households in temporary accommodation. And we have residents in settled situations because it doesn't help them either if they're being accommodated far away from where their support network, or they have to travel from one place to go to take their children to school or to work. So how do we get the system working so that the landlords, whatever charges they need to pay, then that's absolutely fine. But the system works for them in order to help the vulnerable residents, which is what we all want.
And great, and I'll just ask one more question, and then we'll come to the questions from the audience. And just building on that point about the presentation, and you've made it, and you've just made it, Kojo, that the answer to this really is a systemic scale kind of answer. And you, Sharmarke, used, I think, the phrase tipping point. Kojo, you used the term moving from crisis to emergency. I'm just keen to understand, both from the sort of the civil society perspective and also the local government perspective, how much you feel like your voice and the voice of campaigners or the voice of local authorities individually and collectively is putting this on the agenda, I'm guessing, of central government to sort of make those sort of systemic changes. I'd be keen to hear your reflections on that. Jamie, do you want to kick it, or Sharmarke?
Yeah, Sharmarke, yeah. So yeah, I've actually been listening, and I think if you look at the panel, you go researchers, you go Kojo from the local authority. Now, in our perspective, because we do the firefighting for our clients, so we are representing clients who actually, when you talk about extreme, people in extreme poverty, even now we are seeing an increase of, people working the gig economy who are coming to us, carers, these are people whose income fluctuates, so some of the times when we firefight, actually we firefight with the local authority, and we've always said that the civil society organization need to work, in conjunction with the local authority, because that's where our clients are getting the funds in terms of, covering the housing, by benefit and things like that. So I think, just as an example, when you talk about landlords, as Kojo also mentioned, is we don't need to be in a kind of adversarial position between ourselves, our clients, and the landlords. So we've got, for example, a few landlords who've been amazing. One particular landlord, I think for 15 years, he never raised the rent for a particular client. And the reason is the client actually looks after the property. He travels a lot, this landlord. So because of that, he's kept the rent, which is amazing, for 15 years. So I think in terms of, for me, I look at local strategies, so when the council is putting, for example, the homeless strategies together and things like that, they should work with the civil society organizations to try and shape the kind of co-production way to shape that. And for us, I think most of the concerns that we have is around unscrupulous landlords. So for example, in Ealing, we've been able to identify some kind of fraud happening by some kind of landlords who, for example, somebody has a studio flat and he would split that studio flat into, 5 rooms or 4 rooms, and then, of course, so for us, we keep saying to the council, you need to check these properties. You need to make sure that is actually suitable for some of the clients. For example, if you have an elderly person moving into a place like that, where they didn't even have enough space and things like that. So I think it's a kind of for us is a balancing act where I think working closely with the local authority for us as a charity makes a lot of sense, because we're able to give insights into a lot of things that the local authority doesn't know about how the private sector is working, and also to identify. So, for example, at the moment we have an agency that we're working closely with, and they keep sending us a weekly kind of list of properties. And what they've done is actually they look at the lower end of rents. So we think also, I think we shouldn't forget this, estate agents. I think we need to also work with them closely, because they'll be able actually maybe to nitpick, those kind of properties that, our clients. So I think it should be a kind of a bottom-up approach, that we need to use, and the local authority to take advantage of what the civil society is doing, and to kind of come up with so if they're, as I say, they're designing their strategies to involve us in a kind of equal way. So that's what I'm saying.
That's great, and a very collaborative sort of approach. Jamie, from your perspective, do you feel like sort of your campaigning work is bringing this up the agenda?
Slowly. Yes, I mean, I think it's really interesting that Sharmarke said, and we certainly see it in our case, what we are firefighting, and what's better than firefighting when it's making things less flammable in the first place, right? It's getting those systemic changes in place, so that the sort of really real and understandable pressures that Kojo set out that local authorities are facing are actually solvable, which I think in many cases they are not for a given local authority at the moment. And this ultimately comes back to central government, particularly from our perspective. Local housing allowance rates is a no-brainer, at least in the short term. I understand that will of course increase immediate central government spending, but that is to make sure people can continue to pay their rent and stay in their homes. And there is lots of discussion about what that longer term strategy would be. I think, frankly, at the moment, we don't have that longer term strategy nationally, which I think we need. And I think one interesting thing to dig into is, if we are seeing a shrinkage in the private rented sector, what does that mean for the supply for the home building market, and for the particularly building of flats, and trying to tie all this together into a coherent overall strategy longer term would be really, really valuable. But in the short term, the immediate pressure is people cannot afford their rents, and the immediate steps have to be based on that. And that is something that is only solvable at a national level. I think you are hearing it more and more. I think there is some sympathy within the Department for Levelling Up and whatever it's called today for that argument, but we haven't won it yet. And fingers crossed for the autumn statement.
Yeah, great. A good sense of optimism from you both there about sort of local and national sort of efforts on your campaigning. And just before we go to the crowd, Kojo, just about the local authority voice, London councils. Are you finding you're getting a hearing when you talk together as sort of councils?
With DLUC, with the department,
with central government, yes, yeah.
Yes, we are. To be fair, we are. We do have. So we have regular pan-London meetings, and there is a representative from central government who attends, and we are able. So we had, for example, when we had the homelessness prevention grant changes that were introduced this year, we had a consultation with central government around that in terms of the funding and how the funding allocation was going to work. And we did have input into that. And we actually had the local authorities had a meeting with central government before the changes were implemented and introduced. So we do have conversations with them. But I suppose from our perspective, we're always going to want more, aren't we? Because, there's a lot of pressure. And they've got decisions to make in the same way that we as local authorities have decisions to make. But I think that at the moment, what we are doing is we're collecting data on a regular basis around the pressures around temporary accommodation every other month, and we are circulating and sharing that. So we're quite transparent about the issues that we are facing and the further support we need in order to support residents. But yes, to answer your question, we are having communication with them.
That's great. So all that's progressing this agenda. I'm going to go to questions now, and I'm going to start a question to you, Kath. Because in your presentation, this is a question from Joshua Davies. He says, you mentioned there is not sufficient evidence to say yet whether London's PRS is shrinking. How do we answer that question? Is it about waiting for more time and more data, or is there anything we can do now?
Yes, as a researcher, this is a question that I've been turning over for a while. There are big data sets that will tell us this with a time lag. If it would also be possible if you wanted to track individual properties through sales and then what happens after the sale, you could look at the records from the land registry and find out who bought them, contact the buyers, find out what's happening. That would be, I think, the ideal, really, to do some really granular research like that. Unfortunately, it's very expensive because each land registry record, you have to pay for each individual record. So we would love to do that. If we could get the money to do that, that would be one way to do it. Abby might have some further thoughts about data, as she's a data guru.
Yeah, I think we really did feel that broadly everything else points to probably the sector shrinking, but the data is not sufficiently up to date to tell us the answer. So in a data in a bit sense, we just wait. But I wonder if, local authorities we speak to said this is happening. So what could be done at a local level, an informal, probably not done by a researcher level, to just gather what is happening in your patch and present that. I think that is a decent stopgap of, I used to lease this property, I no longer do, as a local authority, I used to lease this, I no longer do. This is what I've seen because I've walked down the street. It's not sophisticated, but it is a stopgap before we can get what we need from Zoopla, Land Registry and other sources.
And just to clarify, so the quantitative data without doing the expensive research, is that a year away or is it 2 years away? When does that sort of become solid?
Yeah, that ballpark. I think Land Registry is slower, isn't it? Because there's a lag on when things get done. But I think Zoopla is probably the first thing. We took a sample of their data that said, had it been listed to rent, was it then listed to sell? Well, if you flip that the other way, that sort of gets you some way to an answer.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. I'm going to ask the question from Sean, which is, how do the panels see the way the planning system as it currently stands as an issue for affordability? So sort of any thoughts on the planning system? Does anyone want to take that question?
Gosh, well, the planning system's always under a huge amount of pressure, isn't it? And I think probably within local authorities, a position we often hear is the national situation is in such a lot of flux, it's difficult to pin down local policies, and without a clearly articulated local policy, you're open to challenge, so you can't deliver and shape. So that's point one. And the other one is about resourcing and consequently skills and capacity. Kojo, you're probably better placed than me to talk about staff recruitment and retention, but it's not an easy position, is it, to staff a planning department at present. So I think just bashing the planning system doesn't help, but we absolutely need to recognise that it is a struggling system at present.
Yeah. So yeah, Abigail, you're right. To be fair, staff recruitment and retention is not just an issue within planning. It's across the sector. You know, we are losing a lot of staff who are exiting the market, so it's quite challenging to recruit specialists in various fields. I think that with planning, one of the key things about planning is, you know, it's absolutely right that you know, planning has consideration for the local area, but for any environmental issues, and preserving various things. However, you know, planning really needs to work as an enabler, not a blocker, because we know that we require accommodation, and sometimes, you know, we need to potentially cut through some of the red tape to actually ensure that we're able to have new build programs work as effectively as possible, as soon as possible, and then ensuring that there is the right mix of accommodation that is being built. So ensuring that we've got, and I know this term is not really one that some people like using, but ensuring that we've got affordable, a proper mix of affordable properties in the portfolio which is being developed. I do understand that developers want to make a profit, but we do need to ensure that any planning permission that is provided, that within that there is an adequate amount of social housing that is available for us to utilise to rehouse our vulnerable residents.
Great, and it's obviously an intensely political area that plays out in each borough, in each sort of ward, and also nationally too. And it's very hard to sort of make any kind of inroads there. So I'm going to ask a question from Ron, which is, with only 4% of landlords having an estimated loan-to-value ratio of 100% or more, according to the English Housing Survey, how will this impact the market? Perhaps a question for Kath or Abby again.
Yeah, so I'm not absolutely clear on how I'm interpreting that question, but broadly, if you own all the equity in the property that you're renting out, then you are in a better position to weather the current financial pressures than if you have very recently bought a property and have a high loan to value. Now, I don't think that a buy-to-let mortgage would ever go that high. You can't work it as hard as you can an owner occupation mortgage, but where landlords are particularly indebted, there clearly is a really tight picture between their outgoings on mortgage interest, operating costs, which is a small part of it, and then tax, and then any profit on top. And the more the interest costs go up, the greater the rest gets squeezed. There's actually a graph in our report that illustrates it, just as a sort of a one type of landlord illustration, just to give a picture. But I think also, if you happened to be a corporate landlord, you still are going to have debt, even though you wouldn't describe it as a buy-to-let mortgage. But as interest costs remain high, the costs on anybody funding with any kind of debt finance is pressured.
Moving on, so how do the panel think that the build-to-rent sector can or should assist rental supply in the future? And that's from James.
Well, I've got a view, but I think it'd be really interesting to hear also from Jamie and Sharmarke on this, because yes, it's about the nature of the accommodation that's provided as well. I think broadly in London and anywhere, yes, there's a huge role for professionally, intentionally provided built-to-rent housing. I am going to just comment that sub-market built-to-rent housing is, you know, council housing, housing association property. It needs some grant to keep it affordable. We should have some of that, please. But I'll stop talking. I would really like to hear from lived experience voices.
Yeah, Jamie, Sharmarke, do you want to take up that question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have a particular view about what the mix of build to rent versus, you know, in individual or small scale, small portfolio landlords should be. I can definitely see that there could be advantages to having more larger scale professionalized landlords as part of the housing mix. I think there is a good question, which I think Abigail touched on earlier, about to what extent do we want to or can we expect a market system to provide sub-market accommodation? And that's in part a political question. It's also in part a practical question, because presumably if there's not a grant, there's some form of cross subsidy going on there. I think just to briefly touch on the it sort of comes back to some of the planning system we were talking about, which is certainly, I'm not an expert in the nuts and bolts of it, but I think, as I think Kojo was touching on as well, a key part of determining whether the planning system at the moment feels to me very input focused. And I think actually considering it as something that should be delivering certain outcomes would be maybe in terms of, you know, to what extent are house prices or rents rising, having something like that as the target rather than the inputs of, you know, who's been consulted, what's the process been for signing this off, it feels like we're leaning too much on the process and not enough on the outcome there. I think if we lent more on the outcome side of it, you might well see more build to rent landlords in the market, and in principle don't see a concern about that.
Sharmarke, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I've just been observing some of the discussions. I think, as Jamie said, and Kojo talked about planning. Planning for me, it's so, and I'll use an example. So we are based in Southall, in the London Borough of Ealing, and it's undergoing a lot of gentrification. So we know gentrifications actually pushes out. So imagine gentrification in already an area where there's a lot of poverty. So that actually does a lot of damage, you know. So people, properties are going to, you know, even if somebody comes to build in the area, the rents will always be high. We're actually seeing people moving to places like Slough, so people are moving out, and then that disrupts also families. You know, maybe they've got connections in the area. Now, in terms of affordable, in terms of planning and affordability, I remember asking one of the biggest companies that are kind of building properties in Ealing, and what I found out is that you know, we don't really understand how the council you know, has policies around you know, in terms of quotas. You know, how many let's say what percentage of the bill should be for affordable homes. So we know we're very clear about that. And again, this comes back again to, you know, everybody working together. So the, you know, civil society organizations, the council, and looking at, as Jamie was saying, is in terms of outcomes, you know, what are the outcomes we need to achieve? Because for me, the way I see things going is things are going to get worse. Unless, and this report has been very good to highlight some of these things. So we need to, and also encourage people. For example, if you look at some of the universities, you know, you have this halls of residence, you know, for students, which I think some private companies have entered that market. So having something maybe similar, you know, so in terms of the mix of, you know, affordable homes. So maybe that could be another, but I think there should be some kind of, you know, working from an outcome-based, you know, point of view to actually, you know, look at how can we, because I think if we focus on, because we'll always have people who, I'll give an example. Today, you might have somebody who has a good job. You can lose that job easily, and you know, you now lose your property maybe, and then you end up getting support from the government. So I think because we are seeing a swell of, you know, people actually, you know, falling down in terms of their, you know, income and things like that. And of course, you got a lot of people who are, I mean, we talk about poverty, and I think there's something around poverty has gone down in London, but we see a different perspective because we're getting more inquiries from people coming to seek our support. So I think if we focus on, you know, for example, at a local level, if we because we have data of, for example, you know, people who are on universal credit and things like that. So I think there should be a profile locally of those residents who are, the income actually quite low, and of course also go people who work in the gig economy, and based on that, to look at, their housing needs, and I think that should also drive decisions around, coming up with policies. And again, we don't want to put off landlords, so I think it's about working with everybody else, and also I think for me, in terms of social housing, there should be another model around that, because what we're finding also is a lot of housing associations actually are increasing their rent. Some of our clients have said, they're almost becoming like what private tenancy used to be. So also we need to look at, housing associations, and how do they, increase their rent, and how do they actually make decisions around that. Thank you.
Can I briefly just
yes,
come back in? Thank you. Sorry, Manny. Thank you. On whoever is providing private rented sector accommodation, whether it's a build to rent, whether it's a large private landlord or a single buy-to-let investor, a key point is around accountability. Now, that could be easier to achieve at scale when you have a large landlord, but equally you could have a system where tenants are just getting overpowered by a large corporate landlord. So I think making sure that whatever the market looks like in the future, making sure that those accountability structures are in place, so that when things do go wrong, that they can get resolved quickly, efficiently, and in the right manner is really, really important. And I think that's more important than the mix of who's doing what.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a resurgence in the sort of tenant voice movement in the past sort of couple of years, really, which has been great to see too. I'm gonna move on to another question, which I think probably I'll start with Kojo, and anyone else who wants to come in after that. So, what's the current policy or procedure regarding cross-borough working by local authorities regarding the PRS, or is it simply a matter of competition by local authorities? And that's a question from Paul.
So we have we've got this this process or initiative where we've agreed between us what the rates are that we're going to pay, so that everybody within London is supposed to adhere to those rates, so that we don't go over those rates and impact on others. If we're going to place anybody in anyone's borough, we are required by law to notify them that we are doing so. We speak regularly at a pan-London level around various issues, and we've got various sub-working groups that are working collectively to try and have a more coordinated approach and prevent competition. We also have sub-regional groups that meet up to talk and address issues to try and prevent competition, and to try and just manage the market and just control the amount that's being spent. Just being transparent, there are instances where some authorities have gone outside of those parameters that we've agreed. I firmly believe that a lot of that is based on pressures that they are facing, because we can agree between us a lot, what we like, but the fact of the matter is, if you're faced with a judicial review threat to provide somebody with accommodation at a particular point in time, you might be under pressure to to do so in each instance. But I think the important thing is about the communication and ensuring that we're just keeping the conversation going. We are all in the same boat. London is not one market, so different characteristics or elements which impact us in Kensington and Chelsea that would impact Westminster or Harrow or Lewisham or wherever. But the important thing is that we recognise the different issues that each are facing and try and reduce the competition, because otherwise what's going to happen is if we do constantly compete against each other, it's just going to further inflate the market and just cause landlords to make us pay off against one another, and that's just not going to benefit anybody. But yeah, we do have conversations to try and reduce and prevent competition.
Great, thanks, Kojo. I'm gonna move us on because we've got sort of 15 minutes or so, and there's a few questions left, and then maybe give everyone a sort of 30-second final word at the end. A question from Maria, who runs the organisation Kiniara. What advice would you give to organisations like hers that are trying to build relationships with private landlords without having monetary incentives to give? Who wants to take that question?
Well, sorry, go on, Abigail.
Well, I was simply going to say that one of our recommendations is about good quality advice, insight into what landlords' decisions and how they might play out, correct information about licensing and things like that. So there's definitely a role for organisations that aren't necessarily giving out cash but are giving out advice. And what I think for organisations like Kiniara that provide tenancy support, they're able to give really good, clear, factual information to the tenants coming to them for advice on what's what, and they could do some brokering directly with landlords to get people in the room, explore different experiences and so on, particularly if properties are perhaps going to be made available for sale. That might be the time when a tenant comes forward to see if you can reach out to that landlord and get them around a table and influence the decision.
Kojo, do you want to follow on for that?
Yeah, I think one of the ways in which you can get involved is most local authorities have what is known as a landlords forum type event that they host periodically. So what I would say is get in contact with your local authority, find out whether or not they host these events, and build relationships with landlords that way, because landlords, local authorities do try and build relationships with landlords and link them in with other services. So yeah, definitely going down the landlords forum route would be a good way of trying to tap into landlords and build that relationship.
And quick, just Sharmarke, I know you've done this too. Just quickly, what would be your top tip?
Yeah, so we have an advice program, and over the years, I think we have about maybe 16, 17 landlords that we almost offer something similar to what estate agents will offer, because we have, let's say, clients, a client maybe who has mental health problems, and as part of our support to make sure that there's no issues between the landlord and the client, is that we continuously provide support. So for example, the landlord might want something to be done, he'll contact us, and we'll work with the client, or maybe it could be that the client has got some issues. So I think doing that is quite important. And also in terms of tenancies, this is the other thing, is that a lot of people we work with don't really, some of them English not their first language, and they don't really know what's included in that, so we kind of go through that. And also one of the biggest problems has been around the deposit guarantee schemes, where people's deposit has been kind of lost somehow. So again, building a relationship with landlords, and also we have landlords who we know that are very, as somebody mentioned earlier on, they're very empathetic, with people who are homeless. So we latch onto those kind of landlords, and some of them have got portfolios. Yeah, so there's different ways, yeah, too.
Great. I'm going to just move us on. There's two more questions. I just want to also mention John Rockley's comment that we should have said that. I should have said that. Forgive me. Around local authority collaboration, that Capital Letters, one of the co-funders, obviously, is a key vehicle for that too. So thanks for highlighting that, John. I'm going to ask Kath the next question first, but you'll all probably have an opinion. So, and it's about rent control. So what are your thoughts on the Mayor's call for rent controls in London? Can it help reduce the pressure on private tenants, or will it reduce the number of PRS properties? And that's a question from Clementine. Kath, what are your thoughts on rent controls?
Thanks for that, Clementine. The Mayor has been calling for some time for the power to introduce rent controls in London. It's not something that the London Mayor has powers to do at the moment. What tends to happen with rent controls is that they benefit the people who are currently living in private rented housing, because the rent in increases are capped, or the rent that can be charged is limited. But for those people who are looking for rented accommodation, it makes it more difficult because landlords become more selective. The limitation on landlords' incomes gives them an incentive to leave the sector, or increases the incentives that we're already seeing. So you have a kind of insider-outsider split. Those who are insiders, those who already have private tenancies would benefit, and those who don't have private tenancies and are looking for them would suffer. So I think on the whole, although it's on the face of it, it's an attractive idea and a quick solution, I don't think it would help.
And anyone have a different opinion to Kath, that think sort of for rent controls?
Not for sort of a hard cap on rent. So obviously that would provide some short-term relief, but there's other ways to do that without the risk of those unintended consequences that Kath set out, which most notably by increasing local housing allowance. We would like to see we're part of a group of organisations called Generation Rent. No, sorry, called the Rent Reform Coalition, which is led by Generation Rent, which is involved in scrutinising the Renters Reform Bill. And we would like to see, as part of that, consideration given to in-tenancy rent increase controls, which is a different and I think less risky form of rent control. Unfortunately, that isn't currently within the scope of the Renters Reform Bill, and we'll be pushing for that as that bill progresses, which was published about 6 weeks ago now.
Great. I'm going to go on to the last question, and then sorry, Kojo, you go.
No, just very, very quickly. I think rent controls is definitely something that we need to explore. The main issue or drawback from that for me would be, with the interest rate going the way it is, what is the impact of that going to be? So there definitely should be something with cap, but what is the impact going to be on private sector landlords? And is that going to be forcing more private sector landlords to leave the market? Because they're leaving the market, and a lot of these properties, it's not as though they're leaving the market and these properties are coming into circulation for us to use. So, what is the cause and effect of doing so?
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to go on to the last question then, just to warn a panel, maybe like a 30 seconds each from you as a final reflection after that, if you want to prepare. But the last question's from Lucian from Housing Justice. And what does the panel think about has been the impact of Article 4 directives, which require an authorization of HMO building restrictions on permitted development conversions on the creation of rental properties for single people? So any thoughts on permitted development, sort of, change of use? Abby?
We did come discuss this in some of our landlord forums, and Kath might want to come in, but there was a definite a very strong awareness of it, and I think, having seen for many years family homes being converted into HMOs, we heard a number of landlords saying, actually, we have done, or we are thinking about converting back because of sort of not wanting to face the sort of HMO regulations, and clearly the Article 4 would stop you from making more anyway. But I mean, this is about sort of shaping what's needed and the effect on the community, isn't it? And it is really important that the residential property provision in an area makes that area work as a sustainable community that is well managed, pleasant to live in, and so on. So yes, we definitely felt that people had been influenced by it, and all decisions need to be taken on an informed basis, as an Article 4 would be.
Kath, do you have anything you'd like to?
Nothing to add, really. We heard there was quite a bit of discussion about that in our focus groups along the lines that Abby said.
Great. Okay, I think that's all of the questions we've got. I'd just like to open the floor really to the fantastic speakers to maybe share a final reflection, a key takeaway for you, or a key next step that you might take from this conversation. So, Kojo, do you want to go first?
Yeah, the key takeaway for me is that I think that there are a lot of people who are interested in this subject, and people who have got a lot of valuable things to contribute. And I just think that we need to definitely keep lobbying central government, but also keep talking, and just being open to just dealing with some of these uncomfortable truths around the market. Because if we don't have these honest and open conversations, I don't think we're going to be able to resolve this issue. And part of that is including, residents, private sector, landlords in the conversation, so that we can try and unlock the issues that are blocking the system.
Great, thank you. And Jamie.
Definitely agree with that from Kojo. I think the other thing to say is that it's really clear from today that a lot of people, or I think all of us on the panel today, are broadly on the same page here. There's not really any disagreement that there is a problem that needs to be solved, and that a large part of solving that lies with central government. I think that is a good platform for us to build on in the future.
Thanks. And Sharmarke, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think I'll echo everybody else, and I think it's about working collaboratively. So, for example, local authorities working with civil society organizations, because we are on the ground. We on a daily basis we see people being threatened by eviction and things like that, and we know the housing stock is really, people are moving, private landlords are moving out of the market. So, for me, I think it will be really interesting to have a system where we're able to identify, private tenants private landlords who have got some kind of social responsibility, kind of ethos. And I think we can actually find those kind of, we've been able to find a few. So I think if we're able to all work together, we might, maybe be able to support some of our tenants, our clients. Thank you.
Great. And so collaboration, a key theme I'll come on to as well. Kath, Abby, any next steps from you both?
Well, I just want to reinforce the importance of our first recommendation, which says that there should be a holistic strategy for what kind of a role the private rented sector is expected to play in our housing system, because the messages coming out over time from central government have been mixed, contradictory. At some points, the suggestion is that the private rented sector should actually shrink because we would like more people to move into owner occupation. Is that what is the government is trying to achieve? We don't have a very good view really of what the end goal of the various strategy and policy pieces is. And people like Kojo are in an extremely difficult position because they have lots of legal duties and responsibilities, but really virtually no mechanisms for influencing the market, because those mechanisms are in the hands of central government. There are very few positive incentives for landlords to behave in the ways that that we would like them to. It's been a lot more stick than carrot, and maybe that should be revised. And I really like Sharmarke's suggestion of finding and reaching out to those landlords with a social conscience. I think that we could think more about how to do that.
Great, thank you. And we've hit 11, but Abby, just 10 seconds, anything you'd like to talk about doing next?
Thank you very much. I think this has been really important in highlighting that all the media coverage we've heard around these issues in the last couple of weeks and months, it's not just chat, and it's really fundamentally important in people's lives, and consequently it needs a big and a strong response. Something needs to happen in the short term, because actually people are experiencing this right now. So we need a strategy down the road. It's going to take a bit of thinking and some action now, please, having taken seriously the experiences of all the participants today and the other people that have expressed themselves in whatever way they're able to.
Fantastic. And in this, for me, in this age of perma-crisis, what's been noticeable is that all the institutions in London, communities, civil society, are often on the same page, actually. And sort of later on this month, the London Housing Panel is going to put a letter with the Mayor of London and local authorities around temporary accommodation to the Secretary of State and also the shadow spokesperson Lisa Nandy. So there's a lot of collaboration going on. I just want to say thank you to all of you for speaking today and giving us your time. It's been a fascinating insight, and thank you to everyone who's attended the webinar and posted questions and answers and taken these thoughts away. The findings will be on our website and also on the council's website, and the video will be on YouTube. And I will let you all go, but thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
a lot, Manny. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye bye. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.